This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV 24/7.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is an especially interesting subject that we've gathered here to discuss today. The idea of what a homeland is in the 21st century, as borders are being redrawn in some parts of the world, as borders are collapsing because of globalization in other parts of the world. Some, like Thomas Friedman, have argued that the world is in fact flat. If it is, what does the idea of a home mean? Is the idea of home a geographical entity? Is it an ethnic identity? Is it a religious identity? Is it an identity driven by language? Is it all of the above? Or is it, as Salman Rushdie has so poignantly argued in Imaginary Homelands, a bit of both, but also something drawn from the past, a past that may exist and survive only in our memories? To discuss this today are two very accomplished and eloquent guests. We have first Shashi Tharoor with us. He's of course a minister in the government, but before this Aftar has really been somebody who has worked on the global stage, has been described often as a global desi, and somebody who never gave up his Indian identity but yet was a citizen of the world. Also, I'm very pleased to introduce from Egypt with us today, well-known author and writer Ahdaf Soueif, somebody I had the pleasure of meeting in not so pleasant circumstances in Cairo when we were there to report the uprising. What does identity and home especially mean in a country where everything's in turmoil, where everything's changing? That's something we'll be asking her. Shashi, let me start with you. You have the official stamp of the Indian minister. You're a member of the Indian government. You have, of course, never actually given up your Indianness, your Indian identity. Yet, for many, many years, you worked with the United Nations. The world was your stage, as it were. How did you simultaneously consider the world and India both to be your homeland?
It was a little easier being a UN official because as a UN official you're always conscious of which country you come from, where your allegiance. The UN gives you home leave to go back to a home country, and in that sense I never had any doubts where that was going to be. My situation is actually more complicated by the fact that I actually was born in England and was entitled to a British passport that I never exercised an entitlement to.
Why didn't you?
Because I always felt growing up in India was of course a major factor. I moved back to India when I was barely 2.5. Went through school and college there before going abroad for graduate studies and then joining the UN. And so in any case my identity was formed by the experience of growing up in Mumbai, in Calcutta and in Delhi. So in any case I had that sense of Indianness inculcated at the right age, as it were. But also, and I've often argued this about expatriates, even those who definitively leave their countries, at some point they look in the mirror and they realize who they really are. And that is something which affects us both positively and negatively. We in India are no strangers to the phenomenon of expatriate extremism, where expatriates abroad are sending money to blow up people in India because of their recollection, as you put it in your initial remarks, of this pure imagined homeland.
The idealized.
They're sort of like the sort of faithless lover who blames the woman he has spurned for having prompted him to leave her. So they go to this foreign country and they say, India is such a wonderful place, if only it was remade in the way it should be, and therefore I will spend money to buy guns or bombs or whatever to destroy the bad things in it that made me leave. It's a very peculiar phenomenon, expatriate extremism. We've seen it, unfortunately, particularly with the Khalistan movement. North American Irish did it for Ireland. So there is this recollection of an idealized homeland and at the same time a consciousness of one's rejection of it. Fortunately, I didn't reject anything. I went proud as an Indian. I remained an Indian at the UN. And then because my other life was that of a writer, I perhaps found it easy too, because a writer really lives in his head and on the computer or the page. And really I could sit in New York and write a book about India, and when I was writing it didn't matter that I was in New York.
Do you remember that exact age, because you said that you were born outside India, where you felt that you were Indian and India was your home, whether it was an idea you carried in your head or a return to the country, which happened much later for you?
I think it was an idea carried in my head in the sense that, first of all, at no stage did my parents ever encourage much thought of anything else. As I said, I was very young when we came back. They were themselves, in a sense, migrants, because they had migrated from the villages in Kerala where they were born to London and then to Bombay. And for them, therefore, when they spoke of home, it was their villages that they dragged us children to unwillingly every year during the school holidays. So already, if there was any debate about where home was, it was whether it was in the urban India, in which I had my friendships and my books and my life and my schools, or the rural Kerala, with which they felt their greatest affinity. Later, when I got my scholarship to go abroad, the issues came up. In fact, the amusing moment when I went to get a British visa, stopped there on the way and then discovered I didn't need one in those days because they said, we can give you a passport. I said, I don't want a passport. No, but we can't give you a visa. And so I actually entered Britain the first few times without a visa because all they needed was the fact that I was born in the UK. India was always what I related to. Even as I began thinking of what to write about, what might endure, it was always about the forces that had made India, nearly unmade it, that might make it in the future. And so I think that sense of allegiance was very strong, and that's what kept me going throughout.
Now, the sense of allegiance, Ahdaf, is an interesting way to define how we all define our own homelands. And sometimes in our heads, the idea of home can be multiple ideas that coexist. For somebody like you, whose latest work, which is, of course, Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, which looks back at being in the midst of those 18 days at Tahrir Square that you said gave you and so many other Egyptians an opportunity to dream. At that time, what was home for you? Because home for you was not that classic narrative of physical displacement. Yet, in many ways, your life had been displaced from the idea of your country. Hosni Mubarak had probably displaced that idea.
Hosni Mubarak was not Egypt. He was never Egypt. And I think that for very many of us, possibly for most Egyptians, the idea of home is really not to do with government or state. Maybe as a child growing up in Nasser's time, that identification was easier to make because you had a government that you perceived as actually working for the people, and so you had a notion of the state and the country being one. But that altered afterwards, and so really the country and the people is one thing, the government, the state is another. So I'm Egyptian. There's just no point even sort of wondering about that. There's nothing to wonder about. I'm very lucky to have two passports. And it was by accident that I ended up living half my life in England for the last 30 years because I happened to fall in love with, a Scotsman really, who wasn't English, and marry him and have two.
And in England that difference would not be considered irrelevant.
No, absolutely. You could not call a Scotsman an Englishman. You didn't do that. So basically, and in those days, the British government just very kindly sent you your citizenship papers if you married one of their citizens. And so I, acquired this extremely useful passport.
But did it mean anything more to you in terms of your identity or your home?
No, not in terms of identity. And I think home has always been to do with the actual physical living space, with the city, and with friends. And I think that home is a matter of community as well. And so I'm completely at home with my British friends, whether Irish or English or Scottish, who think the same way that I do and who embrace the same concepts and ideas and ambitions and politics. Obviously, that's tremendously important. And I was at home in the house that I lived in for 30 years, and in fact in this book I talk about how sometimes I used to dream in actual dreams while asleep, and for a confused moment waking up I would not know quite where I was. And even when I realized that I was in my bedroom in Wimbledon, I would think that if I went out by that door, I would be in Zamalek in Cairo. And so there was this really complete merger.
Yeah. But when you say Hosni Mubarak,
beyond that,
did it feel like a stranger in your home?
Sometimes it did. I think that what the regime was doing very much was that it was trying to build in everybody a sense of helplessness, a sense of a lack of agency, that you could not change anything. I mean, even if people wanted to sort of start up some kind of neighborhood society, that could not be done without sort of, going through authorities and so on. And I think that has been the most powerful thing that the revolution, and I insist it's a revolution, not an uprising, of January 2011 did, that it gave everybody back a sense of their agency. Now, of course, we're still in the process of trying to exercise that, but it's certainly there. And I think home is about that as well. It's about feeling where it is that you can effect change, or where you're relevant, where in fact you're relevant. But I think that there is something very important, and I hope that here in India it is possible to speak about this, which is the issue of where you imagine you will be buried. And there was never any question that I would be buried in Egypt. If I die in Iceland, I would still be buried in Egypt. That's important.
That's so eloquently said, Shashi, and we also have examples of Indians who live outside India, and then as they get older, they feel the need to come back. And it's almost as when you approach mortality, it's like a kind of going back to the womb.
That's very well put, Barkha. No, I think there's no question that Indians are particularly susceptible to this, and it's happening at all ages and all levels. There's already been for some years now a phenomenon of Indians who thought they were going to make a permanent life in the West, suddenly finding in their retirement that they'd much rather be here. And now we're finding youngsters coming back. So there is a phenomenon, there is a pull that India exercises on people, which I think is very strong. Now we can't overstate the argument, because there wouldn't be 25 million Indian expatriates around the world. And I wrote in India from Midnight to the Millennium that we have to ask ourselves whether NRI stands for not really Indian or never relinquished India. And I think there's a little bit of both in most Indians. But what Ahdaf said is very interesting, because of course for Hindus the options are slightly wider. You can be cremated somewhere and have your ashes scattered wherever you like. You can have a slightly wider series of places in India to drop them off.
But since we are asked today to talk not just about home, but also what lies away in all the places in between, I want to start by asking you, Shashi, how do you define home? Do you think it's what Ahdaf said, that it's where you can make a difference? It's where you close your eyes and you say, when I die, this is where I'll be buried, this is where I can be an agent of change? Is it much more intangible? And if we can define what home is, what are the places in between?
So I think there are multiple answers to that. I liked Ahdaf's point about community. I think that's real. In fact, very often expatriates realize who they really are because of whom they're socializing with. You'll find them really in almost ghetto-like relationships with others of their own ethnic background. Another one, of course, is relationship. When I was a child, home was where my parents were. When I went away to college, I'd be going home when I went to visit them. When I went to go abroad and started working for the United Nations after a while, and that was Geneva, which certainly wasn't home in any meaningful sense. I was very conscious I was there. Going home was going home to visit my parents. So there's always a sense of something pulling you in. Today I'm back in India, and there is this indefinable sense of I'm being where I belong. There are moments of frustration, there are problems. I've been through a few things myself, a few Agni Parikshas in my return here, and yet I've always felt whatever these problems are, they're my problems because I belong here. I matter here.
What would be that difference in impacting the discourse, let's say in the United States of America or the United Kingdom and here in India?
A sense of belonging. And I'm not even sure how I can parse that. I know Ahdaf is living in London, has a life there, she's created a career there, and yet the moment this happens in Cairo, she's on a plane, she knows where she belongs. It's that sensible. When I left the United Nations, there I could have both worlds. I was living internationally but retaining an Indian identity. And I chose, without even much hesitation, to come back to India simply because this is where I felt I belonged. I'm not sure how to explain that. It's you stand in the sun and feel whole again in your own skin, right here.
Ahdaf, what happens when there is a damaged love with your homeland? And I ask you this because I know that you said in an interview that for years you wanted to write about Cairo, your city, your home, and you felt there was too much hurt to do so.
It really wasn't a matter of hurt. It was a matter of the tone in which the writing would happen. So if what's happening is that you're seeing a city that you love being constantly downgraded, being treated really badly, take for example the fact that even until now, Midan al-Tahrir, which is the central biggest Midan in Cairo, in the capital, is allowed to sit with 50% of it, maybe more than 50%, turned into a mysterious building site. You know, it's just rubble everywhere and it's screened with corrugated iron. Now why, and that's been the case for 15 years. And then you hear kind of, fires happen or buildings get taken over or people get displaced. The tone in which you would write about the city would be sad, would be elegiac. And I did not want to write in that way about Cairo, because indeed I felt that it was fighting against the odds to remain vibrant, to remain alive. People were kind of like just dreaming up a living out of thin air. And so, the issue was really about sort of, how do you write about that? And the revolution gave me the answer. The revolution made it possible to write about a city that was in fact very much alive and very much resisting and very much coming back into its own.
My question to you is that when dreams don't get fulfilled in the way that you imagine, does it change your notion of home?
No, I don't think so. I think home is home. And I was thinking while Shashi was speaking of two things. I was thinking that we have the same phenomenon. We've had this phenomenon for a long time of people reaching a certain point in their careers abroad and deciding that they had to go home. But with the revolution, of course, we had the phenomenon of lots of young people coming back. But the interesting thing is that we've also had young people from other countries coming back and making Egypt or Cairo their home. And the more interesting thing is that they were also accepted within a community of revolutionaries as people who were making that choice and who were there to help make things happen. And again, I thought this as Shashi was speaking, that home, the difference between being in Egypt and being anywhere else in the world is that I don't question why I'm there. I don't have a moment when I think, why am I here?
Even when you're not happy or things around you are...
Even when things are terrible, you don't think, why am I here? That is a question that just doesn't happen. And it happens everywhere else in the world. That at some point you need to remind yourself why you're there. Even if it's for a happy reason. I'm here because I'm in love, I'm here because my kids are at school here, whatever. But there has to be a reason. Whereas at home, you're there because it's home.
That's right. Makes sense. But, there has also been a suggestion certainly in Rushdie's work in Imaginary Homelands that home can sometimes be a resident of the past. That home resides in your memories and therefore by definition in your imagination. And Shashi, if you'd speak a little bit about what happens, because I know you've seen this certainly in your capacity as a diplomat at the United Nations, what happens when borders collapse or when borders are redrawn? What happens to a generation of Indians whose home was once Pakistan when Pakistan didn't exist, or vice versa? Just to give one example, there are examples across the globe. Does home then become a notion, a strand that belongs to the past because it actually doesn't exist in the present?
It does in some cases become exactly that, Barkha, that people who've lost something they feel they can never regain. Sometimes it's because they feel they can't regain it because of the choices in their own lives, but sometimes it's because the circumstances of that place have changed and they can't go back. And that certainly is true of many, many refugees. I began my UN career working for refugees, and I've seen that phenomenon. It's a very deeply searing human phenomenon around the world. Then you've got the opposite phenomenon of people who have this idealized homeland we began this conversation talking about, and who at the same time want to sort of recreate it back home. So for example, in northeastern Africa, there is a movement for an Oromo There's an Oromo National Liberation Front, and the Oromo homeland has only existed in the imagination of a handful of expatriates, more or less like the Zionists in the 19th century, who invented an Israel that hadn't existed for 2,000 years and were able to create it. But I'm just saying that this capacity to imagine a home and even will it into creation is also part of that. But frankly, it's ultimately a very subjective individual thing, you know. I mean, for example, if you look at Rushdie, since you mentioned Salman, his central idea of home is a Bombay, which in that form may no longer exist.
Ahdaf, the people are sometimes very welcoming of change because they think it will allow them to dream, and sometimes very disturbed by change because it interferes with their notion of what home should be like. Is there some of that self-doubt happening in Egypt today? That was this change actually good for our idea of home?
Well, but we don't know yet what the change is going to look. I mean, you know, some change has happened, but the major change that was looked for, there was never a blueprint for it. There were ideas and concepts, and people knew that they kind of had to really more or less invent what they would actually look like on the ground, and so that really, you know, it's not there yet. I mean, whatever authority is in power, we used to hear it from Mubarak, and then we just heard it from the military when they were ruling Egypt, and now we hear it from the Brotherhood. The notion of istiqrar, which is stability. That, you know, enough revolution, enough turbulence, and we have to have stability. And why do we have to have stability? They tell you that you have to have stability because otherwise the economy will go bust. And that, I think, we all question that assumption. And of course, the point beyond that, the point that the revolution makes is, what kind of stability? What does this stability look like? Certainly, there's no way that the country is going to go back to the stability that it had under Hosni Mubarak, because that's why there was a revolution. And so this idea of stability versus movement is constantly being pushed out. But it has to be said that stability is mostly spoken for by the counter, you know, by the people who don't want the revolution. And just to go back to this issue of whether a home is in your head and so on, there is one thing which is, I think, I'm still trying to work through it, which is that there is a sense in which I think at some point you can never completely be at home, even if you're at home. When I'm not in Egypt, or when for years I was in and out, when you think of home, or when you're homesick, or when you wish to be home, you don't think of Egypt. You think of a specific image. You think of a specific location. And those images tend, of course, to be linked with people. And so I would think of Mahataba. I would think of my grandfather's house, where my aunt created the home that was for all of us, or I would think of being with my mother somewhere. Now, with the disappearance of these people, there is a sense that, in a way, home has gone. You know, or that very kind of intimate, felt notion of home that is closest to you has gone. But something does remain, and that's important. And what exactly the balance is, and are you permanently exiled, or is there some way that you can recreate that sense by taking the place of these matriarchal figures, is something that you know, I'm still certainly working through.
But your awareness of the fact that it is gone is itself what makes it home. Because if it wasn't home, you would not have that
sense of loss, in a sense.
Out of change.
The sense of something being now different, inaccessible.
But what happens, Shashi, when in India we like to say that there's an idea of Indianness that unites us? Because we can't, like many other countries, point to that one thing. It can't be language. The geographical construct is really a leftover of the British. It's not ethnicity. It's not any one idea other than a pluralistic, secular democracy. What happens, or what were to happen, if things were to happen that interfered with the idea of India? Does that change your relationship or my relationship with our homeland?
Well, to me, India can only be pluralist. The pluralism is so built into the DNA, hardwired into the very nature of our country, that if artificial attempts were made to clamp down on it, to assault the pluralism, the democracy, the freedoms that we have now built over 65 years of the workings of this constitution, then I would feel obliged to fight on the other side, as it were, against those who are trying to change that.
And what about what home would mean to people who don't have a state? You see, I often feel that in today's world, it is sometimes fashionable to talk about, how the world is a village and borders don't matter. But if you look at the issue of Palestine, for example, there are people in search of a state where the sense of home actually acquires an urgency that for the rest of us is just taken for granted.
Yeah, when you were talking about changing boundaries earlier, I was thinking, of course, that of course Egyptians are very lucky in that we have had kind of known borders for 7,000 years. We've been a known entity for 7,000 years, whereas, of course, other people are not quite. So, I mean, if it's lucky, but anyway, don't share that characteristic. And of course, being involved with Palestinians who have watched their homeland shrink into sort of lots of little discrete islands and so on, and or have been in exile, it's really an education to see how they keep their notion of home alive, because there is certainly a very powerful notion of being a Palestinian, which of course is also reflected in how they're now trying to go back in the political struggle to a point where no one entity can speak for all Palestinians. In other words, to put it crudely, that the head of the Palestinian Authority cannot speak on behalf of the diaspora Palestinians, but there has to be almost a national council or some body that is formed that embraces the Palestinians of occupied Palestine, the Palestinians of Gaza, the Palestinians who are within the 48 line, within what is now Israel, and the Palestinians who live all over the world. And there is a very powerful notion that they're all Palestinian, and what does that mean? And of course, and it's not a luxury. I think that what is happening is interesting in that this cultural identity is becoming stronger and stronger in the absence of a political, geographical identity of a state. And I think that is very interesting and worth looking at.
It's very true. The Palestinians are always so conscious of being Palestinian, even when there was no Palestinian Authority and state and so on. And in a curious way, I was remembering Maulana Azad writing about how, this argument about Indianness, what is India, and so on, how Muslims, from what we think of as India, and indeed in those days that included Pakistan as well, traveling to Mecca on the pilgrimage, were deemed by all other Muslims to be Indian. In other words, it didn't matter they were from Tamil Nadu or from Punjab or whatever. The fact is there was a sense that the rest of the world had of a civilizational identity called Indian, to which these people were all belonging. That notion, given to us by outsiders, I think is an interesting way too of subtracting this question of identity. If a Palestinian, when he's outside Palestine, says I'm Palestinian and not whatever other passport he's carrying.
What happens when exile takes place within a nation state? In our country, Kashmiri Pandits strike me as an example. You're married to somebody who's experienced that sense of exile. And again, like with the Palestinians, if you look at the community of Pandits, it becomes then this very tightly knit kind of community, because they feel that only perhaps kindred spirits can understand their sense of displacement. Now there you have a nation state, you have the larger sense of home, but within the home, it's like you got thrown out of, the neighborhood you grew up in. And
the Kashmiri Pandit reality is a particularly sad and painful one. I know it intimately now through my wife's own family, because they were right from the heartland, from the valley, village called Bomai north of Sopor, which was, they were urged to flee by threats from the terrorists. They fled. Their house was attacked and burned, and this was already a couple of centuries old, wonderful old mansion, completely burned. And yet, and of course they were exiled. Sunanda's parents actually settled in Jammu, which is still within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but they don't think of themselves as being at home, because home is always the valley for a Kashmiri Pandit. Sunanda herself lived abroad for many years, but for her always, when she spoke of going home, it was wanting to go back to that village. And I remember when we first got to know each other, her showing me photographs of the ruins of the burned house that she had visited at one point 10 or 15 years after, and there was still some walls standing. And one of the first things she wanted to do with us as a couple was to go back to the village and see those ruins again. She wanted to go home again. Now what was interesting, we went back to the village, even those ruins were gone. It's been picked clean. The walls are all gone. There's nothing there but grass and a mound. But what made it still home was all these villagers who hadn't left, the Kashmiri Muslim villagers, coming out and embracing her as one of theirs and asking her why she wasn't back and so on. And it's very interesting, this is a very, very insurgency-prone area. The army and the intelligence didn't want us to go because I was a political figure and I could have been a target and so on. And yet, the warmth with which she was embraced, they wouldn't let her go. That's what made it home.
That's interesting, and we haven't yet been able to provide a solution, even though things have improved so much in Jammu and Kashmir, for Pandits to return to their homeland. Ahdaf, how important is it to feel a sense of security, to feel like you're at home? And I asked you this because I remember the night I met you and interviewed you in Cairo, it was in your own home, your house, and at that time we were in the middle of this revolution, but it hadn't culminated in the fall of the Mubarak regime. And because you felt you were being followed at that time and people were, trailing you and looking to see what you were saying and to whom you were saying, your last words in that interview were, "Tonight I will not be spending the night in my own home." Now, of course, you meant literally the house. But there wasn't a sense of security. And I'm just wondering, how important is that for any of us to feel at home?
Well, I just want to tell you I wasn't being sort of melodramatic. I mean, the fact was that the concierge had come up after you came up. They arrived with their cameras and equipment and everything, and 2 minutes later my doorbell rang, and it was the concierge's daughter actually, and she said, "Who are these people who've just come?" And I was just totally taken aback. What do you mean? And I said, "They're my guests." And she said, "Well, of course you're free to have guests, but the mabahith, the sort of, the FBI kind of thing, have been around and have asked who talks to foreigners and who has anything to do with the media, and we are going to have to report to them if there are foreigners or people to do with the media." And so basically we still had the interview, and I even made tea, but I didn't feel comfortable spending the night there. I called my son and he said I should go to my brother's, and we spent the remaining nights until the fall of Mubarak at my brother's.
Do you feel safe in Cairo today?
Oh, I feel safe in Cairo. I feel completely safe in Cairo, as safe as possible. I mean, the thing is that we have activists being sort of snatched off the streets and so on. It continues. Of course, a very sad fact about revolutions and so on is, or in general, is that the people who tend to suffer the worst damage are the poor. And if you are middle class, and if you're a bit of a figure, then you tend to feel that you've got
a security.
And I mean, sometimes it turns out not to be true, of course, and you're got anyway. But you don't, on the whole, go around feeling vulnerable. And I was thinking while you were talking of we have a. When you listen to an Egyptian or an Arab, there will always be the moment when they tell you a proverb. So this is your proverb moment now. And we have a proverb that says, الفقر في الوطن غربة, which means basically that poverty in your homeland is an estrangement. And so all that sense of security and entitlement and power and unquestioningness and so on is also really to an extent linked to economic factors, and I think that's important. And I think also that is part of the reason why the revolution gave everybody a renewed sense of Egyptianness and of belonging, because this was a revolution that was so very, very clearly on the side of the poor and the underprivileged and the disadvantaged.
I'm going to take a few questions, but Shashi, let me ask you in the end, how intrinsically is freedom, or a certain set of freedoms, linked to the idea of home, picking up on what Ahdaf said? And also, in the age of globalization, in the age of easy movement across borders, where some people like to say that actually you should be a citizen of the world, that is the liberal idea, is home a parochial concept?
On the first part, I think home is precisely where you're free to be yourself. Yeah. It's true in the literal sense when you go to your own home, in the physical limited space that implies, but it also is true, I think, of the homeland. It's where you're free to be yourself. So if the homeland's freedoms are being artificially curbed so that you cannot be yourself, then indeed one must challenge whether that's still home anymore. And that's why so many people with a very strong sense of place have lived away from their homelands during certain times. I mean, someone like Garcia Marquez, who obviously had a very, very intimate sense of home, was away for decades because of the political situation that didn't let him feel free to be himself. So that's a thing. On the globalization argument, well, I was sort of, in a sense, a citizen of the world working for the United Nations. When I said we, I didn't mean India, I meant the UN, I meant the world, you know. There was always that sense for nearly 3 decades. So in that sense, I think, yes, I was that, and yet I do believe that one is simultaneously that and something else. Precisely because it's so amorphous. You know, you have a sense of allegiance, a sense of belonging somewhere. I remember Amartya Sen saying to me once that he felt as much at home in Calcutta as in Italy as in Cambridge. And I think as in both Cambridges, because he was also in Cambridge, America. And so, yes, I think someone like him, at ease with his own mind and so on, the life he's leading, he can be at home anywhere else. But if you ask where he's actually focused most of his intellectual energies on, where he keeps coming back to, where he's accepted a sense of identification with the nation, it's still clearly India. And I think citizens of the world like himself, and he's very proud of the fact that all human beings have multiple identities. I am too. He argues that we shouldn't reduce ourselves to any one small identity. We have many identities. But I would argue that to have a sense of where you belong is not a parochial or a reducing act. It is one that complements and in some ways supports all your other identities.
Just one example came to my mind of President Obama. Like, he was born in Hawaii, he grew up in Indonesia, and now, I mean, day in and day out, he relates himself to USA.
I still think that if you were asked what his homeland was, he would not hesitate to say America, United States of America. And clearly, the way he's grown up very conscious of himself as an American.
We have a few minutes, I think, to take a few questions. Yes, go ahead.
We have discussed the emotional, philosophical, somehow political definition of home. But we haven't said where an individual might want to be in a country and not be allowed, no matter after how many years. I'm talking about myself. I have lived in this country for 35 years. It was a choice. And I'm married, I have a child, and I completely 100% feel at home here. I'm Iranian. I feel totally at home here. And I can say that, okay, when I go home, I feel rather Indian. Because I've been here since age of 19, and those are the years that matter. My child is Indian, my husband is Indian, my friends are Indian, my garden is Indian, my university is Indian. And yet, this is what we haven't discussed. When the governments come into it and say, sorry, you might feel at home, but we don't recognize that.
Shashi, do you want to take that?
I mean, it's about once you are an Iranian, you have that tag on your forehead. This you
I'll answer what you said.
We've discussed this before in Jaipur. Once you are Palestinian, you are Palestinian. So you are a Muslim, you all know. You are a Muslim, oh boy. You have to watch out wherever you are. Now, I'm an Iranian. We are in theory a civilization that has a lot in common with India. And where are we today? Because somebody else said Iranians are terrorists.
So are you saying that you would like to be Indian but the government isn't letting you, or are you saying that you'd like to go back to Iran? For that right. Right.
But unlike you, I want to be recognized as somebody who's in this country their home.
To be honest, I'm not replying as a minister. It's not my ministry, so I have no authority in any case. But I do believe that we should be more open and accommodating. In fact, if you look at our NRIs, an NRI who marries an Iranian woman in New York would be able to give her a PIO card, PIO being person of Indian origin, simply by being married to her, even though she's actually Iranian, not of Indian origin at all. But within India, unfortunately, it seems to be more problematic. So the simple solution is get your husband to move to New York, get a PIO card, an OCI card, and then come back. I'm joking. I understand yours a real dilemma. I don't know the answer, and it's not genuine, not my ministry.
Okay, let's take the question from the gentleman at the back there. Yes.
I'm General Bhattacharya speaking, retired. I would like to differ a little. Home and homelands are two different concepts. My home lies today in Bangladesh in a district called Mymensingh. I visited that as a child, and memories I'll never forget. But my homeland is India.
Yeah.
The conflict till I die or till I go to my grave, I don't know where my resting place should be. I've got a place at Barkha in Calcutta. It's a deep conflict that's searing through my heart. Always a longing when the borders will open up and we'll be together. Just a concept I would like to throw across. Please treat homeland and home differently.
I think that's very interesting, and Ahdaf, do you want to take that sometimes there is a difference between your home and your homeland, because your country or your adopted country, because history is not static.
Well, this is exactly the issue of exile and the issue of changing borders and so on. And I thought, there's really nothing to say. That was a very eloquent statement.
Shashi? Somebody who, again, because to pick up on what Ahdaf said, where you want to be buried, where you want your ashes dispersed, and for him, home and homeland are different.
No, I think, and particularly our subcontinent's history has made that happen. For 5 decades, there were Germans who thought like that, and then there still are Koreans who are going through all of this, where a natural existence has been sundered by political and historical events. But the fact is, I'm sure there are people in Pakistan who feel that way, all sorts of places. I would say that you probably got the distinction right. There is a broader homeland, which is the place that you fought to defend and to which you owe your allegiance, and that homeland is India, which means that in that sense you would have had to die for Kerala, even if your ancestral roots were in Mymensingh, and yet yes, you do have a sense of where your roots are, and unfortunately in this case the roots have been sundered from your life, and these things do happen.
The lady there, question there, yes.
In the Indian concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, if we say, the world is my home, that's an ancient concept that we've been ingrained into. Where do we discuss homelands vis-a-vis Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam?
The world is a family, is really what I mean, but you're right in a sense that the notion in Hindu philosophy is very much a universal one. It's all-embracing, and it does seek to include all. Even when you get into issues of God and religion, the notion is always that there's only one truth, and there are various ways to it. So in that sense, the willingness to embrace the different is very much part of Hindu philosophy. But I think we are speaking in a little more sort of, shall we say, literal sense of the feeling of home, because every human being has something to which they feel affinity, to which they feel allegiance, and we're calling that home. I think it would be unrealistic to expect somebody who's grown up in a village in Bengal to suddenly feel that an igloo in Iceland or whatever in northern Norway is just as much home for him. There'll always be a greater sense of connection, and I think that's where we are. But no one certainly, I think in this group, will disagree with the broader notion of the entire world being ours to embrace. I've known Ahdaf for a quarter of a century now. I know what a cosmopolitan person she is while being rooted in Egypt. I I think similar things can be said about me, and of course Barkha has been all over as well. So I think, in a sense, your question is fair, but it is beyond the terms of this conversation.
All right, a question here from the lady here in the grey jacket, please. Yes.
This question is for Ms. Ahdaf Soueif. I'm Egyptian, and I would like to say that you have been an icon for many people in Egypt. And I happen to have watched the interview that you referred to, and we were wondering whether you would disappear or come back. And I'd like to commend you because you have inspired so many of us to continue the fight. And seeing your courage and your involvement, even though Egypt is not your actual home right now, it's your home, but your home living is in England, but you always came back and you always fought, and you've inspired us a great deal.
Thank you. You're extremely kind. I'm flattered and embarrassed, and for 30 years I came and went, so I was between, but from January 2011, in fact, I've been in Egypt. I mean, I've left when I've had work to do, as I am here now, this minute. I'm not in Egypt, but on the whole I am in Egypt, and the container with all my furniture arrived in Egypt 3 weeks ago. It's in storage because so thank you very much for this. It's very encouraging.
All right, the last question we have time for from the young gentleman here in the grey blazer. Yes.
Good evening. Most of the narratives that we have heard today, people have identified most closely with the place they grew up with as their home or their homeland. Just one example came to my mind of President Obama. Like, he was born in Hawaii, he grew up in Indonesia, and now, I mean, day in and day out, he relates himself to USA. So, in your view, I mean, do you see it as a dichotomy, or is it just something, just the other side of the coin from what we have heard today?
Shashi?
Thank you.
No, I still think that if you were asked what his homeland was, he would not hesitate to say America, the United States of America. And clearly, the way he's grown up very conscious of himself as an American, while indeed having this broad sensibility and a very great awareness of his heritage. So, but you know, his great influences. You know, his book was called Dreams of My Father, but his father was somebody he'd had very little contact with. I think they met 2 or 3 times before the father died when he was about 10 or 11. So you're looking at somebody who grew up as an American, but was conscious there was something else somewhere. But he's been back to Kenya. I don't think he's ever called it home. I think ultimately one does make a choice, even when one has a complicated heritage. Whether in my case it's an accident of birth somewhere else, or in Ahdaf's case it's a marriage. I mean, you will find influences crowding in upon you. But at the end, there is something, one thing, to which you are unavoidably tied, and that ultimately is what is home.
Well, I think in the end what we can say is that something we didn't maybe explore enough is that there is also a world of books and ideas to which we all escape, and we all feel at home in those little imaginary corners that offer us refuge from the world. And I think literature too can be a place of rest and a place of belonging. And on that note, I would like to thank both Shashi and Ahdaf for their writings, for offering us glimpses into their homes and allowing us to be at home with them. Let's have a big round of applause for our speakers.